You're watching The Business of Law, brought to you by Bloomberg Law and the ABA Journal. I'm Lee Pacchia. Legal education reform is back in the news after President Obama recently endorsed the idea of making law school a two-year endeavor. This comes after a protracted debate in the media and academia over the state of legal education. Joining me now via Skype is one of the more vocal critics of the status quo. We have Professor Ben Trachtenberg from the University of Missouri School of Law. Welcome, sir. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me back, Lee.
Of course. Okay, so we had you on the show about 6 months ago to talk about the ethics of law school marketing, and we touched on the cases of two former law school deans that ran into trouble for falsifying employment data for recent grads. Can you bring us up to speed on recent developments with respect to these cases?
Sure. There's been news on both of them since the last time we spoke. One of them was Mark Sargent, who used to be the dean of the law school at Villanova in Philadelphia. And he was a lawyer admitted to the bar in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts recently suspended him from the practice of law for a period of 3 years, starting last month. And the suspension was based on Massachusetts's equivalent of Model Rule of Professional Conduct 8.4c, and that rule prohibits lawyers from engaging in dishonesty, fraud, misrepresentation, and deceit. And what he had done, when this was well known, we talked about this 6 months ago, what he had done was lied to the American Bar Association, to U.S. News and World Report, and anyone else who was asking about the qualifications of his incoming 1L law students. In other words, the GPAs from undergraduate school and the LSAT scores of these students, which helped boost the school's rankings. And they were caught doing it. And Villanova got in a bunch of trouble for it. And it took some time, but he just got censured by the bar and suspended from practice. The other one was a man named Paul Pless, who had been in charge of admissions at the law school at the University of Illinois. And he was a member of the bar of the state of Washington, which for very similar conduct just reprimanded him in March and April when those documents came out from Illinois.
Right. But it's hard to look at these two examples and draw parallels to the current state of legal education. One could see these two examples as outliers getting in trouble for extreme behavior. How does one tie this back to legal education on the whole, if at all?
Well, I would not argue that what we saw from these two people is common in legal education at all. But what I would say is that legal education still has a problem with giving good, forthright, usable statistics that are fully honest and giving good disclosure to prospective students. And as we spoke about some time ago, our salary statistics are still skewed in ways that make the salaries of our recent graduates look higher than they really are. And this isn't an example like we saw with Pless and Sargent of people straight up falsifying the numbers, but it's still somewhat, in my opinion, inaccurate. And I think very few people would stand up and say that what many schools report as their average salary is actually anything like the middle salary of a graduate from the previous year's class. And I can imagine some state bars at some point saying, look, you've known about this for so long and you didn't do anything. We're going to call that misrepresentation. We're going to call that dishonesty. Do I expect that the bars are going to jump all over this the way they would if someone is engaging in outright deceit and falsification of data to the American Bar Association and to magazines? No, it's not the same. But the spirit of this rule, which is lawyers have a duty to engage in forthright and honest marketing, law schools are supposed to be teaching future lawyers how to behave. And there's a lot more that we could do.
Do you see schools looking at these two examples and taking a meaningful lesson from it? Are people going to react to this as an event?
Well, I think they're probably looking at it the way high schools look at it and elementary schools look at it when you see teachers or principals caught fudging the scores on No Child Left Behind or something like that. Everyone says, oh, that's horrible and we shouldn't do that. But I don't think you're going to have a lot of people at many schools sitting around saying, we've got folks doing what Mark Sargent and Paul Pless were doing. And if they do, then frankly, they're probably so far gone on the question of whether you should behave honestly that I'm not sure how we can influence their behavior. Right. But I think, as I put out a piece very recently in the online portion, the online bulletin of the Nebraska Law Review, really saying that the American Bar Association and the Association of American Law Schools, they could do a lot more. Because we don't need to have situations where every single person at every school in charge of putting statistics gets in trouble with the bar. That's not a useful thing to do, and it wouldn't be fair to a lot of people. But the ABA could say, look, this is the new standard for getting stuff right. If you don't publish your statistics in a more forthright and honest way, you're going to get in trouble. The ABA could say, we're going to hire someone to do random audits of certain law school statistics. which the ABA has talked about doing. And to its credit, the folks at the section on legal education and admission to the bar do seem to be taking more of a proactive stance than they have in the past. But there's a lot more that they can do. I have no doubt about their sincere desire that schools do a better job. The question is, how much attention and resources can they put toward encouraging them?
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be having this conversation. Ben, we have two press releases out from the New York State Attorney General's office in recent weeks on actions against education providers, one against a for-profit educator and another going after Trump University. It's rare to see prosecutors go after higher education institutions for misrepresenting what their services will entail for the consumer at the end of the day. I got to ask, this in mind, should law schools, particularly those in New York, be worried?
Well, most of the attention about schools behaving badly in terms of the outcomes of their graduates has been focused on for-profit institutions. And in some ways, nonprofit institutions are very lucky because they haven't faced some of the same scrutiny.
Why is that?
Well, I don't know. In part, I think it's because a for-profit institution has shareholders who get to go home with a sack of money at the end of the year if there are profits. So perhaps the incentive to engage in chicanery is higher. It may also be that people are just a little bit more suspicious of for-profit institutions. Nonprofit institutions like law schools in the state of New York have a long history of public service, and I think they generally get a fair amount of benefit of the doubt and deference, particularly from folks like attorneys general who are products of these law schools and are less likely to have graduated from, say, Trump University. Mm-hmm. But if you read the Attorney General Schneiderman's press release carefully, one of the things he criticized the institution with which he settled, I think, for $10 million, was that they counted people as employed because they had these very short-term jobs. I think often working for just a day or two at some health fair put on by the institution itself or at the institution's instigation. Well, if you read the stories of what happened at law schools in the not too distant past, many schools were employing their recent graduates who didn't happen to have jobs on the day of the 9-month survey at which these were measured, 9 months of graduation. They were people employed in part-time jobs for 2 weeks just so that schools could say they were employed. And I don't think if you asked Eric Schneiderman if that was honest marketing, he would say that was a great idea.
Mm. So, Ben, before we let you go, wanted to get your thoughts on what you make of President Obama getting behind the idea of making law school a 2-year degree. Good idea or bad idea?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential for it. Many other schools allow people to get trained and licensed to be a lawyer without having 7 years of education after high school. You know, in the United States, generally, you have to get 4 years of college and 3 years getting the JD. In almost no other country is that required. You can become a lawyer in England or in Ireland in much less time. And I don't think we can make a credible argument that American lawyers by our nature are just superior to those in the United Kingdom or in Ireland. So I think there is a lot of room for innovation on this. That said, the current economic model of American law schools is based on the idea that the students come through and stay for 3 years. We have numbers of faculty that are based on the idea that we're going to teach people for 3 years and get tuition for 3 years. So there's going to be a lot of growing pains, or perhaps you would say shrinking pains, if our student body disappears or shrinks to the tune of 1/3. And to be perfectly honest, we're seeing this at some schools already as the number of students applying and matriculating at law schools goes down. So this may be a particularly difficult time to convince law schools that they should behave differently. On the other hand, if the state bars, which decide what the minimum qualifications are for being a lawyer, allow schools to experiment in some ways, there may be schools that are ready to jump at any chance to innovate, to say to students, look, you can save a year's tuition by going here. So maybe we previously would have seemed expensive, but now, of course, we're 1/3 less expensive. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea from a policy standpoint, but as you said, there are an awful lot of questions as to how you would go about implementing such a policy if they decide to go forward. Professor Ben Trachtenberg from the University of Missouri School of Law, thank you for your time today, sir.
Thank you, Lee. I enjoyed it.